.4 million New Yorkers, including 1 in 5 city children, are currently living in poverty. That's according to an annual report issued by the City Hall. A total of 1.4 million New Yorkers, including 1 in 5 city children, are currently living in poverty. That's according to an annual report issued by the nonprofit Robin Hood Foundation, showing that the city's poverty rate is nearly twice the national average and disproportionately impacts Black, Latino, and Asian New Yorkers. This is also the first time the study has spotlighted the experiences of Asian American communities, finding that roughly 1 in 4 Asian New Yorkers lived in poverty in 2020. This year's report, which was done in conjunction with Columbia University, examines how government policies, including direct cash transfers and tax credits, actually kept the poverty rate in our city from rising sharply during the pandemic. Joining me now to talk more about this is Richard Bury, the CEO of Robin Hood. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Errol. Appreciate being here.
Let me ask you this. Your report shows widespread and pervasive poverty in New York, worse than in other parts of the country. In your opinion, what are the main drivers of that? Why does that happen?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Errol. As you said, we issue this poverty tracker every year. It is based on a survey of thousands of New Yorkers. We survey them every quarter, trying to understand their experience living in poverty in New York. And there's a couple of things that we try to do in the poverty tracker. One is we're trying to understand the experience specific to New York. So that means, one, looking at different government revenue streams, tax benefits, other kinds of benefits that help increase the money you have available, but also looking at the cost of living in New York. And so it's not surprising, given the nature of our economy, where we have lots of New Yorkers who work in industries that are particularly susceptible to the pandemic, but also in the community that have obviously extremely high rates, high cost of living, and everything from housing to food. It's not surprising that the experience of New Yorkers in poverty and living near poverty have been so much more intense than they have been in many other parts of the country.
I see in your report that, look, we cut the poverty rate for adults and children in New York who were poor. It was cut by nearly 60%. It translates to over 1.9 million New Yorkers who moved out of poverty. That strikes me as a really big headline, really big news, and really important. But when I look at economic news, they talk about, Elon Musk might buy Twitter, or, the Federal Reserve is going to raise the interest rates by half a point. This strikes me as something that we need to pay a lot more attention to rather than act like it never happened. Is this sustainable? Is this teaching us something that we can maybe hang on to try and move people out of poverty?
It is absolutely teaching us something, and you're absolutely right, Errol. So often we look at the news, the economic news, and we're seeing a broad picture, but that broad picture fails to account for the experiences of particular communities living in poverty. One of the things that is a highlight of the last few years is that we've seen that government policies can make a difference. Things like the child tax credit, expanded unemployment insurance, the emergency rental assistance program in New York, the excluded workers program, that federal, state, and city policies that are directed towards those of us who are most vulnerable in our society can make an absolute difference. In 2020, we saw that these, as you said, it effectively cut the poverty rate by 56%, moving 1.9 million New Yorkers out of poverty. Now, that's the good news. The problem is that many of those policies were temporary. Things like the child tax credit, things like the eviction moratorium. These are not durable policies. They are policies that have disappeared or are disappearing. And so all the successes that we've had, we risk losing. It is both a success and the tragedy of government policy, that we know so much about what actually works. We know how to make sure that our youngest New Yorkers, our most vulnerable New Yorkers, have what they need to be successful. And yet we don't have the political will to continue the thing that we don't have to speculate whether they work. We know that they work because they've been working.
The Robin Hood Foundation specializes in finding programs with strategies that are measurable, that are replicable. What are some programs you've seen lately that you think deserve more support and maybe could be brought to scale?
Oh, across the board. I mean, one of the things about working in New York City is that we have the strongest, the most effective, the most impactful nonprofit sector in the country. And so across the board, whether it's innovative supportive housing programs that tie affordable housing to social services that help New Yorkers stabilize their lives so they can move forward, to effective educational programs, everything from high-performing charter schools to programs in district schools that we know have been successful in helping young people achieve. You know, the good news is that we have all sorts of examples, all sorts of exemplars about what works. And the challenge for us as a city, like everywhere else, is making sure that we are taking those programs that we're seeing work across the board and amplifying them, shining a light on them so that we can learn and replicate from effective models, and especially to work closely with city government to make sure that the city is adapting more and more of those policies that we're seeing have a demonstrated long-term impact. I'll give one quick example. You know, one of the most successful programs that I think we've seen across the country is a program in the City University of New York, which, by the way, is one of the most remarkable institutions in the country in terms of helping people escape poverty and enter the middle class. Two programs, CUNY ASAP and CUNY ACE, these are programs that have doubled the graduation rates, one in the 2-year colleges, one in the 4-year colleges, through straightforward and eminently replicable interventions. We see you have a massive difference in young people persisting through college, and therefore, and we know what a college degree means in this economy still, and doing it affordably because it's CUNY. So we have examples of that, and it's a perfect example because that's the place where, you know, with CUNY ASAP, the city took a model that was originally privately funded and privately evaluated by places like Robin Hood and others. And then that has become a big part of public policy and has been adopted in many places throughout the CUNY system. So we've got examples of that. We got to keep doing more of it.
Okay, sounds good. One of the real eye-openers of the report was the extent and depth of Asian poverty, Asian families and communities in New York City dealing with poverty. Is there a special initiative that's needed, or does it fall in the same categories as the broader poverty that's long afflicted Black and Latino communities?
Well, it's always special, and you're absolutely right, you know, Errol, it shouldn't be a surprise, but, you know, we know that Black and Latino communities face substantially higher rates of poverty and material hardship and health programs than white community. What we were able to do in this poverty tracker by oversampling Mandarin speakers and oversampling Asian Americans who speak other languages, English and Spanish, is seeing that the rates of poverty and disadvantage in the Asian community is similar to Black and Latinx community. And it's hard because, you know, that community is so diverse. Hundreds of languages, literally 200 languages and dialects stemming from 40 countries. So we tried very hard. We didn't do a perfect job of trying to oversample. And so what I would say about the Asian American community is it's so important to shine this light because we often have this idea of the model minority. And that myth of the model minority means that we're not paying attention to what the Asian American Federation calls a crisis that is hidden in plain sight. And so I think what is important is that in some ways it's the same strategies, but understanding that you always have to have cultural competence when you are addressing these concerns. So understanding the particular realities of, I can't say the Asian American community, the Asian American communities. You have to understand those communities to be able to be effective. And the first step is shining a light on the problem.
All right. This report does that and much more. I want to thank you for coming by tonight. You've got an upcoming gala at the Javits Center. I think, John Legend's going to headline there?
We've got John Legend performing. I'll try to spare you. I would sing for you, but I'll spare you.
No. I'll wait for John Legend.
We've got John Mulaney coming. We're going to raise a ton of money to help fight the problem in New York City. We have some big surprise announcements. It's going to be a great night for a great cause.
Okay.
Standing together as New Yorkers to fight poverty in New York City.
All right. Okay. Well, good luck with that. Thanks very much for coming by tonight, Richard Bury.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Always a pleasure.
We've come together because we know that setting families on pathways out of poverty is a moral imperative. And to find the right solutions, we must follow the data. The data tells us that before the pandemic, 1.2 million adults and 350,000 children in New York City lived below the poverty line. But this statistic doesn't tell the whole story. In 2012, we partnered with Columbia University to launch the Poverty Tracker, a groundbreaking study of life in New York City. Instead of taking an annual snapshot of the poverty rate, we check in with families to track how they experience disadvantage over time. By doing so, we've gained a better picture of what economic security and insecurity really means. It's not just about each family's income. It's about the real-life hardships they face. In 2019, nearly a third of adults and 35% of children struggle to afford housing, healthcare, or food. That's 2 million adults and 600,000 children in New York City who experience material hardship. And then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic impacted all of us. But it's those who were already at a disadvantage who were hit the hardest, pushing families that could least afford it to the brink of disaster. And as the number of cases soared, more and more families were faced with the grim reality that they simply couldn't afford to get sick. But of all the dynamics exacerbated by the pandemic, none was as severe as the crisis of racial injustice. Before 2020, Black and Latino New Yorkers were already disproportionately likely to face hardship, and the pandemic hit them even harder. While nearly half of white New Yorkers were able to work from home, many Black and Latino New Yorkers lost their livelihoods because their jobs required being on site or were in industries impacted by the pandemic. As for the men and women classified as essential workers, they too were predominantly Black and Latino, and nearly half lived near or below the poverty line. It could have been even worse. Estimates show that without government responses like the CARES Act, 1 million more adults in New York City alone would have been in poverty in 2020. However, while the CARES Act and other benefits may have curbed a massive rise in poverty, they have had little impact on the immense economic disparities between white New Yorkers and New Yorkers of color. Our research gives us a clear picture of the fight ahead. If 2020 was a year of crisis, we need to make 2021 a year not just of recovery, but of reform and renewal. So let us come together to face these challenges head on.
And I and you all are very lucky today to be talking to one of the world's leading experts on child poverty and deprivation and the consequences of it, Irv Garfinkel. Irv is the Mitchell Ginsburg Professor of Contemporary Urban Problems at Columbia. And I've been following his work and learning from it for decades, years and years before the current craze around universal basic income. Irv was doing really pioneering work on how cash can transform lives of people in poverty. And he's doing great work, again, during the pandemic right now. So Irv, I wanted to start by talking a bit about the pandemic and where things stand. You and your team at Columbia are doing a lot of work around tracking where poverty is going during this crisis. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, we've developed a model that looks at poverty on a monthly basis, and that was actually in response to the pandemic. And when Zach Perlin, who took the lead on this, first developed it, I thought it was a crazy idea, but it was actually a very good idea. And I believe there will be another session that will deal with that model in particular and what we found. But it's clear that the poverty rates, national poverty rates, spiked dramatically, and that the previous CARES Act, the Relief Act, made a huge difference and kept poverty from increasing. It would have increased dramatically, and because of the CARES Act, both the unemployment insurance provision and just the cash provisions made a big difference.
And so that was sort of a proof of concept for giving cash as a way to address this kind of vulnerability. And we're hearing a lot more proposals for doing that as a kind of permanent policy, a child allowance, which I know is an idea you studied a lot.
Yeah.
What do you know from social science work by you and others about sort of the long-term costs and benefits of a policy like that?
So the first thing to say, and this is kind of the first research we did, is it would have a dramatic impact on child poverty. So the American Family Act, that's almost all the Democrats support, would have a child allowance of $3,600 for children 0 to 5 and $3,000 for children who are 6 to 17. And by the way, I should add, Senator Romney's proposal would actually be slightly more generous for the first child, but it's financed largely by reducing other poverty programs. But if you look at the effects of the American Family Act that's embodied, I should say, in President Biden's American Relief Act for 1 year, that would reduce child poverty by 45%. A bigger reduction for Blacks and Hispanics than whites, so it would narrow racial gaps. So that's the first thing to say, and that's an immediate effect. But back to your other question about long run effects, that's kind of amazing. We started a research project, it's a year ago, a little over a year ago, to look at the returns to investing in children if we were to have a child allowance of $3,000 for the most kids, $3,600 for the younger kids. And what we did was we reviewed the literature of what there's now. We found 20 studies, high quality studies that are mostly quasi-experimental studies. A bunch of them are based on food stamps and the Earned Income Tax Credit. And the effects that are documented on children are just remarkable. So starting with birth. So if the family was getting a benefit, birth weight was higher, lower, much smaller proportion of low birth weight children, less neonatal mortality, better health as a child. As they grow into adults, better health as an adult. They live longer, they get more education, they earn more, they pay more taxes, they're less likely to be involved in child protective services or the criminal justice system. 19 of 20 studies show positive effects across the board. So, and then we had to put dollar values. That was the exercise, to put dollar values. I should point out, if I can just backpedal for a moment. So the National Academy of Science did a study, which you're familiar with, the roadmap to reducing child poverty. And as you know, they found
The moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But in the state of California, that I'm seeing this afternoon, sorry that I'm here on a kind of dash-in, dash-out basis and schedule, but I want to talk about it is just as necessary for the concerned person and the person of goodwill to condemn the intolerable conditions which continue to exist in our society which cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative but to engage in violence in order to call attention to their problem. But after all, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and democracy have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, humanity, and equality.